Alrighty, we are back, everybody. We are back to the second time today, the bonus episode of the Two Chaps, Many Cultures. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And we have our special guest today, Joanna Sell. Joanna, pani Asia, dzień dobry, jak się mamy?
Dzień dobry, super. Dzień dobry, Brett. Guten Tag, Christian, beziehungsweise guten Morgen, oder?
Guten Tag geht schon. Ist schon Mittag hier. Hallo, hello, dzień dobry, and that's the extent of my Polish. So.
Well, welcome to you. We're going to do a little bit of each language. Maybe we like to serve the broad audience, right? So we have to kind of maybe a little bit of language we can throw in. My Polish is terrible. Of course, I have two great German speakers here. One excellent native Polish speaker in Joanna. Welcome, Joanna. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
No problem at all. We're always interested in stories, and that's your forte, right? Your forte, your specialty. So you're always teaching us how to use stories to improve our global development. And I guess as Christian and I do this work in the intercultural field, we often use stories to put some context around what we're teaching and, of course, what we're learning too. So tell us a little bit about the Joanna Sell story, please. Just a nice little introduction of where you're from and what brought you to this work.
Yes, so gentlemen, thank you once again for the invitation. What brought me to this work? Actually, at one point I relocated from Poland to Germany, from Krakow directly to Hanover, which was a very, very nice, challenging point. Everybody kept asking me why from Krakow, the most beautiful city in Middle Eastern Europe, to Hanover, the most beautiful city in the northern Germany. Except for Hamburg, except for you name it. And the reason was pretty simple, because of love. And actually, afterwards, I relocated still to Strasbourg. And when I went to Strasbourg, I had an internship at the culture TV channel Arte. And this is the moment when I really saw that people spoke the same languages, German and French, and they, even though they were bilingual and really fantastic in speaking both languages, they used two different cultural codes and they didn't really understand each other. So it made me really puzzled, because back then I had seen this trouble. They had to agree upon a common good program, TV program for different people in Europe. And this was the beginning of the passion for intercultural communication, when I said, okay, the language is not enough, even though I speak French and German, and all of them, it's also the case for them. This communication gaps exist. And this is where I decided to add to my two former studies one more program at the university, intercultural trainer and coach. So this was the first moment when it really worked. And then afterwards, of course, just like many in our field, I worked also pretty much with cultural standards, with cultural dimensions. I never ever mentioned any numbers. First of all, because I don't memorize any numbers. Second of all, because I never ever believed them. And at one point I saw that sometimes, just using the cultural dimensions without really using them in the context, without really telling stories, without really encouraging the participants to share stories, doesn't bring up any forward. Sometimes they didn't even have any stereotypes at the beginning of the day, and at the end of the day they had plenty of them. So this was the moment when I turned to storytelling, story sharing, when I said, okay, first of all, people are sharing different experiences, different stories, and then they are going to have a look at what actually it means to them. And the third motivation to work with stories was actually because I simply saw that it works. I saw that it works not only in the professional context, but also in the private context. I love skiing. I'm a born skier. And this is how we met plenty of people in the skiing holidays, in different huts, just sitting together, sharing stories, laughing together. And by the way, one of the stories is wrong. There is a lie.
Okay.
Life?
Lie, a lie.
A lie. Oh, okay. And when you say that, what do you mean by that?
That one of them is not the truth.
I think the skiing. She made up the skiing.
Ah, okay.
Maybe. I'm not sure.
I love skiing. You are right, Christian. And still, I'm not a good skier. I'm really glad when I make it down to the slope.
I think you can love an activity without being good at it. I have that with tennis. I love playing tennis. I suck at it, but
but it's so much fun. Yeah, welcome to the club. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so this is actually, one of the ideas how we can work with stories. That it doesn't have to be always really sharing stories of the most important moment, of stories of vulnerability, of really something tense. Of course, this is where storytelling applies at a very, very enhanced level of communication, and this is why I love it so much, especially when we use it in the diversity, inclusion and belonging context, but also right now in the current theme of racism, polarization, xenophobia. But also we can bring a little bit of lightness, so to use it as an icebreaker and really to enter this space of sharing stories in this light way, so that people are not discouraged, like, oh, tell me the story of your life, everybody is like, oh.
And my experience around storytelling is one that I only picked up, and I'm not saying I'm good at it, so we're back at the skiing thing. So yes, I love storytelling too. I'm not necessarily saying that I'm good at it. However, I discovered it for myself after moving away from Europe. And I think the storytelling initiative that is your story, Joanna, is at least in my experience, a little bit reflecting of our upbringing in Central Europe, where our communication style, the way we are taught in school, is not necessarily around storytelling. It's more about fact telling.
Definitely.
And I learned this here in the US when a sales trainer told me, you know how to convince a prospect to buy from you. It's not by inundating them with the facts and your spec sheet. And he said an axiom that rings in my head since then. It's this American way of selling is facts tell, stories sell. And I looked at him and said, you've got to be crazy, because if you try this in my culture, in my native culture, nobody will buy from you, because you're just telling a story and not giving us the straight facts. So I think a lot of the impetus that I felt to tell stories to clients, or in a casual conversation even, is because I left my native culture. And I don't know if that was similar for you, because you left Poland for Germany or for Alsace, and working for Arte. And for those of you who are not familiar with European television programming, Arte is the television manifestation of the European Union. It's TV that exists because France and Germany buried the hatchet. And it's beautiful, but if you don't understand French, you will only understand half of their programming, and if you don't understand German, you only understand the other half of their programming, right?
However, Christian, they have changed. They have really changed because they have introduced more languages, and currently you can see lots, or actually most of the programs with the English subtitles, or in the original version in either English, Spanish, or Polish. So they introduced 3 more languages, which is really fantastic. So it's getting European.
Right, and that's what we need. And my favorite, and before I forget this, because it's totally off topic, but when you said Strasbourg, I was like, yes, that reminded me of my last trip to Strasbourg, which was, I think a year and a half ago, and I had my kids with me, and I pointed something out to them which was completely foreign to them, and this is warming my heart whenever I go to Strasbourg. When I enter Strasbourg from the German side, so I cross the Rhine River, and as you cross the bridge over into the French side of Alsace, there is this commuter train, this light rail, a tram, so to say, and it crosses the river, and there is no border patrol, and there's no barrier. The only physical barrier is the river, but nobody cares because there's a bridge over which we cross. And there is a commuter train that does not only serve the city of Strasbourg, it serves the surrounding areas, and it crosses a national border, and it's called, I think, Le Européen or something like, I don't know what they call it, but it's a train symbolizing European unification. Beautiful. So that's my Strasbourg story.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, it's wonderful because this the European spirit is so vivid over there.
Yes.
Yeah. So as you hear, both of us, we are such great Europhiles. Do you say so? The Europhiles, actually, huh? Europe lovers. This is the proper word.
I'm a staunch supporter of the European idea, which has been under fire for several years. But and I've shared this before, and Brett, you stop me if I'm repeating myself. But I grew up in the 1980s, so my teenage years were in a divided Europe, in a divided Germany. And I was 18, 19 years old when the Berlin Wall came down and the Iron Curtain fell. So my upbringing has taught me that bringing people together is better than keeping them apart. And the second lesson is that walls don't work. So
welcome to the club. Welcome to the club, Christian, because when I got to know my husband, it was back then in Krakow. And actually, it was still time because it was still before 2000 that we had to travel, him by plane, me by bus, sometimes he because of solidarity by bus as well, so by this coach. 12 hours one direction, and we never ever knew how long it would take us because additionally we had to calculate some waiting time at the border. So because of love you can do quite a lot. However, you can do it when you are maybe, I don't know, 19, 20, 20, whatever. And I still remember at one point when we were flying to the United States on holiday, I was sitting next to one US American lady, and I told her this story. It was so obvious to me that when we got to know each other, we were, traveling once a month by bus, 12 hours plus. And she said, wait a minute, you are based in Poland, aren't you? Yes. And he's based in Germany. Yes. Why don't you fly? It's only 1 hour. And I was like, this is the word of obviousness. Back then it was, of course, out of reach. Yeah. Because of the price. So
and the availability, there was not a daily flight. I was
exactly, and no choice. So this really, really cheap flights were emerging just later on. So this is really something that is very, very important in the intercultural context, that when we share stories, we have a better understanding for someone's behavior, Well,
so Brett, did you ever drive across the continent of your home country, or did you fly?
Brett?
I'm sorry? No. Kristen just said, did you drive or did you fly?
Oh, I'm right now. I prefer driving because flying seems to be a bit risky. But I'm curious. So you grew up in Australia, Brett. So what's the story of commuting or experiencing the country down under? Is driving even a thing because the distances are so extensive, or is it part of Australian culture to experience the country, getting it under your wheels?
Yeah, when I was growing up, we would go and visit. I had a grandfather that lived in, he lived in Sydney and they lived in Melbourne. So our story was getting up and, packing the car the night before, and we had a station wagon. And, back in the days when, seatbelts were kind of like not as important, the back seats would go down, and me and my brother would get the luxury of laying down and sleeping in the bed, and then we'd wake up starry-eyed at some ungodly hour when the sun was coming up and stop for breakfast. And so this was road trips were not so much road trips adventures. These were the way you got around. Okay, I didn't fly until I was 15 for the first time. So that using the car over such great distances was really the only way that you could get around, although that we had a lot of really good public transport. Another reason why I'm also a Europhile as well is because the public transport is so wonderful, and it's an experience. So I was sharing in our episode this morning about how watching the human experience when you're traveling in airports and things like that, right? And I find myself guessing people's stories, Joanna. So this is one thing that I kind of look at people and I go, it's interesting that I'd be fascinated in that person's story, because I know it's all different. And back to your story about doing the 12-hour commute for love, right? But somebody looks at you and goes, that's crazy. What are you doing? You're in the country next door to it. But without the context of understanding the history, understanding the situation, like, and for those who don't know, my wife is Polish too, and I love going to that country. It wasn't always open, right? And so there was no freedom of travel. So this is an interesting, there's always asking people's stories. It's also like I want to bring in the context of our great friend Kelly MacLeod Chingan, who says there's storytelling and also story listening. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
So that's about kind of gathering the stories of other people and really listening to them, and then maybe asking if there's not something you don't understand. If there's something you don't understand, not say that sounds crazy. Maybe just say, okay, can you tell me why that is? I think I'm missing something. I don't know. Is that how do you relate that when you're facilitating, when you're coaching, when you're teaching in any context, Joanna? How do you prompt stories with people? Some people from some cultures are not comfortable sharing stories. So how do you prompt that? Like you said, icebreaker thing. That thing you started off with, one thing I just said is a lie. I find that a great way to do it, right? Because people are really listening. They're really listening to the person introduce themselves. They're listening to it because I want to pick up the lie. I want to pick up the lie.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to do it. So how do you prompt? I know you've got some tools you use and that kind of. How do you prompt people to share their stories or come up with the stories and that kind of thing?
Thank you for this question, Brad, because it's the tricky part about it, Everybody speaks about storytelling, especially Christian. Also, you have also emphasized that it's really used also in the selling context, in the marketing context, as a tool, as a tool that sells. And this is the tricky part about it. Because of this approach, it got somehow hijacked. And I think what is really important is that we need to a little bit get back to the roots. Actually, all of us, we have sharing stories in our DNA. This is what makes us human. This is what makes us really able to connect with each other. So story is the shortest distance between two people. And with this in mind, the most important thing is really to create this atmosphere of psychological safety. So in order to work with stories, I really need to know who I'm going to work with. It makes a huge difference if I'm going to do it in the university context with students, if the group is homogeneous, because there are also groups like that, or if it's very multicultural. If these people are stuck at the university because of COVID-19, or they are really in this ordinary context, if the people are actually all of them from one country, however, from completely different cultural contexts. This is what happened to me when I offered a storytelling workshop in Kuala Lumpur last year, when they had the participants from 3 different cultural groups, actually. So the Chinese, the representatives of the Islam, which is the dominant religion over there, and also the Tamil Indians. Yeah, nobody would say Tamil Indians. The Tamils. Yeah? So people of Indian origin who live in Kuala Lumpur. So so this is the tricky task, especially for the facilitator. For the teacher, it's a little bit different because it's a little bit of this context. Oh, as a teacher, I'm sharing this story, and then I hope that everybody feels encouraged to do so. As a facilitator, especially in such a multicultural context, you need to set the scene. So, bringing this lightness at the very beginning as an icebreaker is a nice beginning. However, then what I pretty often do is show also why it simply works. And this is the moment where I introduce more of the details regarding neuroscience, so that when we share stories, we address not only the neocortex and our rational thinking, but also the limbic system and also other emotions. And not only emotions, but also the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. So when people share stories, they immediately can, have this idea that these pieces of information embedded in their stories are going to be memorized much, much better way. And people will remember them because they are hooked, they are curious. Every story has got an arc, the beginning, the climax, and the end. So, it's not something like, okay, next slide, next fact, but really something that triggers us. So, of course, sometimes it's really hard to set such a psychological safety. And actually, it happened to me not once, not twice. It's part of the game as a facilitator, because what actually can happen that people burst in tears because, they are triggered by their own story. What can actually happen is that people don't relate to the story someone is sharing. And this is actually what happened in Kuala Lumpur, because I had a huge adventure over there. My plane got cancelled here in Hanover, and then the plane from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur because of snow. And Christian, Germany, Hannover. It snows once a year, and it was again exactly this day when it was snowing in this corner of the world, So I was completely fed up. I had to reschedule this plane, and unfortunately, because of that, I was able to fly not on the same night, but the next morning via Munich to Singapore, changing planes in Singapore and going to Kuala Lumpur, which meant that I was over there at 9 o'clock in the morning. At 9 o'clock, the workshop was supposed to start. So my tandem partner from Kuala Lumpur rocked the show. We were all the time in touch. And without really thinking of it, that I'm in the completely different corner of the world, I had so much adrenaline. I entered the room and I simply shared the story with them, And I started with this stupid comment. Can you imagine? I really love snow. And this moment, I was fed up with snow. And they looked at me and they were like, hey, what is she talking about? She's talking about snow, So you need to know your audience. You need to know how you actually address them, so that they also feel encouraged to share stories and not taken aback that you are talking about something completely crazy. And what is also important...
Did you give them a physics lesson, how water turns
how the snow is built, the crystals. What is really important is actually the feeling for the energy in the room. So this is really face-to-face, really important. And also, having a very intense conversation, not only during the workshop, but also in the breaks. Sometimes the breaks are more important than the workshop. And in the virtual setting, it's always no risk, no fun. So yes, Brett, you joined my event on Vis-a-Vis Art Adventure last week. So you also experienced, that sometimes it can work really, really well. Sometimes it's kind of, yes, nice activity. Next. Yeah.
Right.
So it also depends on the group dynamic. It depends on the expectations. It depends also on the readiness to share stories. It's not everything that depends on me. What I always encourage people to do is actually to think of the experiences. So I never ask them to share a story. I mostly tell them, especially in the leadership context, can you think of a moment, or can you also share such a moment when you really enjoyed being the leader? Or when you can recall such a situation when you were very, very courageous, and this was the moment when you felt proud to be the leader of these people. So this is something that, you know, changes a little bit the approach, and people immediately switch the thinking about it. And I think this is something we need more currently, so that we focus very, very much on challenges, that we re-narrate a little bit, that we, re-narrate not, oh, what were the biggest challenges during the COVID-19, for example, but instead, oh, what actually worked and why, and what do I want to keep from this time, you know? So really just this positive psychology.
And what you just referred to was what Brett said earlier about story listening. I think if a good facilitator can encourage program participants to share their experiences and go into whatever narrative it may be, it makes it they relive that experience that they're sharing, so they make the program their own. So it's not a teacher, lecturer, facilitator in the front of the room lecturing to them. It becomes their story because they're bought into it, because now they're adding their puzzle pieces to the picture, and it becomes a more holistic experience, for lack of a better term. What I need to practice, or not need to, but what I want to practice, and I have been practicing, it's simply similar with my skiing and my tennis skills. I'm still getting there. Is telling a story, or starting off with a narrative, and as you said, introduction, build up, climax, and then the end of the story. I try to open loops for my audience. So I start telling a story without giving them the end of the story. I leave them hanging like a cliffhanger, and intersperse throughout the time that I have with them, intersperse little clues as to how the story continues, but I only close the loop for them at the end of the session. So that's kind of a trick to extend that narrative arc, I don't know how to pronounce it, till the end of the session. It takes all of my brain power to do that. It's not always easy, at least not for me. But that's a technique that I noticed works well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very, very nice. I love it. I call it open-end stories.
Oh, yeah.
And I describe this process also in 2 chapters in the books on storytelling, one in German, one in English, because, it triggers curiosity. And actually what happened in one of the train-the-trainer courses on storytelling, how to use storytelling in the intercultural context, was that I combined it with the story circles. So I invited the people to share such open-end stories in the story circles. So they were in tandems, they were in couples. Normally in story circles you are 3-4 people, so that you've got more of dynamics. However, in this case they were just in couples, and they had very intense conversations, asking each other what do they actually think, what is the end of the story, and also giving the feedback in the story circle when the end was shared. Oh, what was the most surprising moment for you? So, with this intervention, you trigger not only curiosity, but also very deep self-reflection, because also the storyteller hears from the story listener, wow, this was the most important or most catching part of the story, even if it's not the case for the storyteller. And this is what they shared in the forum afterwards. So, when we think of story listening, it's storytelling doesn't make any sense without story listening. It's the biggest present, the most fantastic gift we can give each other in our current turbulent times when everybody's run out of time. So that we listen not only with the ears, but also with the eyes, that we also observe each other, would really pay attention to the facial expression, that we also focus on what is said, and that we at least try to listen without the attempt to react to what is said and not to judge. This is really the enhanced part of listening. Yeah.
It's hard to do that in this context, especially in social media. I find myself, and I don't know whether other people do it, when people make comments that I disagree with or I don't know the context, I often will go to their profile first, right? I'll kind of try and understand, and it'll tell me a lot about the person. It'll give me a little bit of context into where they're coming from, what their frame of mind might be. And of course, many times just that act of doing that stops me from reacting in a visceral way to maybe something they've said, and just understand it that in the heat of the moment, somebody might say that because of a certain context. But when I've looked at their other story, their bigger story, I've seen, this is actually an intelligent, educated, thoughtful person, and so. This is what's kind of missing in interaction, right? It's one of the kind of the difficulties about this current situation is that we're missing those personal interactions. Yes, I mean, I've transitioned a lot of my work, and I know Christian has, and we all have, to virtual. But I'm also learning about the studies of how we miss the small cues that we don't have when we're in person with somebody, which is just, that's just part of the challenge. But so we learn to work through them as much as we can. But I've always loved storytelling because, and a lot of my clients say, "Oh, you've got lots of wonderful stories." Well, I've just stolen them off everybody. It's thievery, but it is basically just when you can get an example of an academic, and I'm not an academic, but an academic idea, something that we teach in terms of our intercultural practices, but to be able to put it into a context and say, okay, that's for the real smart people. I say that's the way I say it. That's for the real smart people. For me, I can only demonstrate this in a story, and this is where it's applied in my life, or it's applied in my friends' lives, and that really resonates a lot with people, I find.
Yes, definitely. And I think what is really important nowadays is to listen to those stories that were on the margin so far, because there are plenty of voices that are finally heard. And this very, very strong narrative that are counter narratives to the dominant stories. So this is really an eye-opener currently. It's really important to listen to everything what is said, but also to think what might be not verbalized because of some still fears, because of power, and because people sometimes are not ready to listen to the stories. In the United States, it's pretty similar as it's the case in Poland, that the societies are polarized. So, my learning from sharing stories regarding politics is sometimes search for another theme. Yeah.
I'm guilty as charged. I know that I was not always ready for a story from my marginal perspective, or I'm not saying from the margins as if there was a foreign land that you can pinpoint on a map. It was just on the margins of my perception, and this is a very subjective margin, I guess. I wasn't always ready to hear those stories, and the last couple of weeks and months have amplified my ability to listen to some of these stories, or the stories have now from my margins have gotten so loud that I cannot ignore them any longer.
Exactly.
And I really vividly remember a phone call I got from one of my African American friends the day after George Floyd was murdered. And this is a full-grown man. This is a very alpha type male, very assertive, and gives you the impression of being sure of himself. And he was on the phone with me crying his eyes out and saying things like, why can't I be a human being like everybody else? Why are you killing us? And he was not accusing me personally. He was just the way he phrased it was a level of frustration that is hard for me to comprehend. All I was able to was listen, and at some point I cried with him because that's all I could do. So I agree with you, Joanna, that some of the stories that we haven't been ready to hear, and when I say we, it's the dominant majority in many societies, the way that we are slowly learning to listen to these margin stories is something that is also, at least my mission, and I would suspect it's also part of what you guys do, is to help others develop the ability to listen to stories that have not been heard yet.
Brett, would you like to comment?
Yeah, well, that's what I do. I can only learn because I'm not, I've come to this work, through experience, through seeing the effect of the lack of hearing and understanding has caused other people and myself. I'm guilty of it just as much as anybody else. So I really find my only access to it is to listen. My only access is to listen, but also turn it around and relate it to other people. And hopefully it has the same effect on them. It doesn't always. I'm not expecting it to. It does cause some frustration to me, in my mind, sometimes when I can't get through to somebody through telling a story. Their mind again is in that reactive mode. I'm just listening until you can shut up and I can just tell you what my idea is, right? My interpretation is. So it's quite difficult. But I don't think it's work that we should ever finish, right? It is an ongoing task to keep telling stories and keep inviting the stories of other people.
Keep inviting them, but also, co-creating them together, because this is this point in our human history that we cannot underestimate it. We've been already talking about this dominant narratives. The term is clear for everyone. Also the so-called concealed stories. So the stories that, are very traumatic, and we know that we inherit emotions. So we inherit emotions. This is scientifically proven up to the third generation. So, great-grandmothers, grandmothers, moms, and the youngest, so to say. You see, I'm talking about women all the time. Sorry, Brett. Sorry, Christian. But you know what I mean. Grandparents as well. And these are the concealed stories. So this that were already on the margins and nobody really talked about them, not only because of power distance, but also about this extremely traumatic experiences. So, some generations were trying to deal with them and to put them apart, not to really address them because they were extremely powerful. And of course, I also see the comment from Kelly, we live in stories. We live in stories, not only our stories, but also these inherited stories, and they are extremely powerful. So, the next point, these are the stories of resistance. So when all these concealed stories come up somehow, and the people from these underrepresented groups keep saying, we want our voice to be heard. And this is exactly what is happening, not only in the context of racism, polarization, xenophobia, but also LGBT, and so on and so forth. So, so this is a huge context. I'm not talking about female aspect and female leadership, because then we would finish tomorrow morning. Right. But the next step.
Well, generational too, Joanna. You can't do it. Like about Tamara, our wonderful friend Tamara Thorpe, who talks about generational. She's the millennials mentor, right? This is about hearing the stories of people from different generations and not undervaluing them. They're important.
Exactly.
There's all these different things there.
Definitely. And as for the millennials and also this generation, we finally have to introduce more visual storytelling, because this is how we attract also their attention. These are these people who don't read, one-pagers, because they don't have time for it. They don't have patience. These are the people who are attracted by really strong visual stories,
That's why we're here. We're
That's
creating
why we're
visual
here.
stories for them.
Yes. So the
Anymore.
very last point in this is definitely, to find courage really to co-create together this transformational stories. So how do we want to coexist, and building connectivity despite the differences? Search for similarities and really search for common stories we want to co-create. This, what I have just said, this is, by the way, not something, let's say, out of the heaven. This is the model Lee and Bell created, and this is the model of stories for social justice. And by the way, Brett, maybe you can remember, this is the model Kelly, who is also present here in the chat, introduced in our interview when I had the chance to interview her last year in Leuven in Belgium. And you were so kind and were our director, cameraman, technique guy, and the biggest supporter of the project ever. Thank you.
Oh, I don't know about that. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I'm glad Christian was there too. That was fun. For those that don't know, it was the CIATA Europa Congress in Leuven, outside of Brussels last year. Wonderful, always a good chance to get together with people that do our work and share stories. But I want to just pick up on something. This is important: co-create. Because in our interview with Tayo Roxon the other day, we talked about, because I heard him mention something about organizations, just bring it into business context. Organizations say, well, we need to be more inclusive, therefore we need to open the doors to other people so that we can invite them in. But that already suggests a sense of power that really shouldn't exist. It shouldn't be up to us as the white, I don't know how to describe it, but it shouldn't be up to the power who think they have ownership to invite people in. It should be assumed that everybody has ownership already. Yeah. So co-creation is saying you and I are equal. We're equal partners in this, and we come together to tell a story, not because, well, right now Black Lives Matter is the big thing, so I'm going to tie onto that and I'm going to invite people in and be very nice about it. No, that's garbage. Yeah. So I'm just here kind of co-creation is really important. That's what I really love about it. I want to work with people that, to me, come to me with as equal partners. Sometimes there's going to be different dynamics. They have better knowledge, better education, better assets to be able to share that. So therefore, it is incumbent on me to just shut my mouth, right? That's the reason we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, is to shut my mouth and listen and let that person take the lead. And it may be up to me to be called on to do that as well in a different context. But it's still about co-creating. It's still creating something that's going to resonate with people, to encourage them to do as you're so greatly teaching, is to develop, is to really use that to develop globally, develop a mindset of global mindset, a growth mindset, which kind of go together. Good friend, I'm just starting to get to know, Chaba, who's developing the ICQ, who developed the ICQ disc, says, they're not mutually exclusive, right? There's global growth, global mindset. They're together, and we have to bring all of ourselves to these stories. So I think it's fascinating. I know we're going over. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not holding you guys up, because we are going over. And yes, Joanna, we could talk until tomorrow. That would be,
definitely, yes.
So, I mean, we should probably do it again if we can schedule it again. What you've got an event, you've got some things coming up later this week, Joanna, that you're hosting, and tell us a little bit about that in terms of your activities.
Yes. Oh, thank you that you mentioned it. Thank you. I'm really honored that you mentioned it, because you experienced this big experiment last week, and afterwards I felt really encouraged with the feedback, and I said, wow, this is the right path. And this is also actually part of my story, that what would have actually happened if I had been more honest to myself and played all the cards years ago. When I told you that my experience at ATE was really driving me towards intercultural communication, it's only part of the story, The second part of the story is obviously being a girl, right now a woman, originally from Poland, whose great-grandfather died in Auschwitz, married to the German guy, whose grandfather was in Krakow, so next to Auschwitz, exactly in the same time. When I got to know him, actually my heart was beating, and I asked him simply, oh, how long were you there? And you cannot imagine how relieved I was when I heard 3 days. And then I asked myself, okay, what would have actually happened if I heard 3 years, And this is also something that we underestimate, that as soon as we know a very powerful story from the books, from the films, from, I don't know, whatever source, but from the outside world, it has got an impact on us. And still, when it becomes part of our family story, it can be a huge driver. So, there are plenty of stories that we need to reconcile. And this reconciliation is the basis of building resilience. And I guess this is really important in our times right now, how we are going to look at this really, really tense period of time with COVID-19. It depends mainly on us and also the stories we are sharing with our kids, with our partners, with our best friends, with our clients as well. When we keep saying that, oh, this is really a very, very tough time, and we want to get back to the normal, and we focus all the time on this what doesn't work instead of this what actually works pretty well, we don't do any favor to anyone, So I still remember such a moment when I really had to let's say reconcile different stories. One of the stories also regarding my education, that the very, very first studies was actually art history. And the art history made me very much aware of the power of the visual stories. And this is right now the answer to your question, Brett, that my project currently, finally, after so many years, combines art, experience of art, really almost art therapy, with intercultural communication, storytelling, and at the very end, with the coaching question, so that people after such a session have got a coaching session they can still work with afterwards. So what actually happens in these sessions is that I invite everybody to 3 different art institutions. It could be galleries, museums, creativity doesn't have any borders. And then we dive into sharing stories in the breakout rooms, come up with what we have learned from each other, what we have heard, what stories do we want to have more of, what stories do we want to stop telling. It's also important, so that we don't do much more harm than necessary. And what stories do we actually want to co-create really consciously together, so that we can spread more hope and optimism. So this is exactly what is happening in the sessions. And so far there are 3. So on Wednesday, I've got one session on racism, skin color, And the re-narrating practices, by the way, over there, we are also going through the whole story circle with stories for justice, social justice. On Thursday, we are talking about Babel, so the symbol of multilingualism, and how this multilingualism impacts also our personalities. Very, very interesting theme. So Christian, wenn ich Deutsch spreche, denke ich ganz anders niż jak mówię z tobą wręcz po polsku. Just an example. When I speak...
Ja, die in Jensik.
Ja, so geht's mir auch. Mhm.
Yeah, it also impacts our behavior, our body language, also our thinking about ourselves. And last but not least, on Friday, we are going to talk about Alcantara. Alcantara is the Arabic for the bridge. So how to bridge cultural differences. So you are very welcome. 5 o'clock Central European time. And
nice. That's
good purpose.
In the morning for me. That's good.
It's before cocktail hour, and which is always good for us.
Thank you for sharing that and making that available to everyone who's listening or who is watching the replay. As you see, this is live here on Facebook and on YouTube. However, it will be conserved, so some of you may be watching this after we broadcast live. The link is in the comments below. Click on that and you will find interculturalcompass.com and where you need to go. Thank you, Joanna, for sharing your stories, plural. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for having me, for hosting such a great conversation.
Oh, dziękuję bardzo. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and thank you to the wonderful comments. We had Kelly, we had Patricia, we had, who else? We had Barbara. Barbara was there. Barbara was there. I don't know whether she's still there, but we had a lot of great comments there, and thank you for sharing those. And we've, as Christian said, we've got the links to Joanna's activities there in the comments, and we look forward to seeing you Wednesday, Thursday and Friday for those storytelling events. In the meantime, tomorrow, back with the two chaps in the morning, back to our regular scheduled programming, as we always like to say. And in the meantime, when too much culture is never enough, we want to encourage you to always be looking at your story and telling your story, and also, most importantly, listening to your story as well. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you from us, and we'll see you again soon.
Danke, ciao, tschüss, bye-bye.
Dziękuję. Danke schön.
Bye.